Have you ever had a bad boss? Raise your hand if you've ever had a bad boss. Don't look at them if they're in the room with you. Some of you are self-employed and you rose your hand. I'm concerned about that. Yeah, if you've ever had a bad boss. About 20 years ago or so, it's hard to believe it was that long ago, but about 20 years ago I started working for the college on a full-time basis for the first time, working in the admissions department as a recruiter. Admissions counselor was the technical title, but basically I was a recruiter. And I was there for about 4 years, and I had not just a bad boss, but a handful of bad bosses. And they, boy, I could tell stories forever. Well, one of my bosses, I guess, in the 4 years that I was employed there, he came to my office twice in 4 years. He had an open door policy, you know. You ever had a boss with an open door policy, but their door was always closed? This was that guy. He came to my office twice, once to chew me out for an email that I sent holding him accountable for something he said he would do and didn't do. And the second time was to say, hey, I heard you're leaving, good luck. Like that was it, honestly. And it was this guy and some of the others in my time there that prompted me to become a student of leadership. I looked at that situation, looked at myself in that situation, looked at the college and its influence and impact in these things, and I said, there has got to be a better way of leading people than doing this. And so, as difficult as that was at that time, I am thankful that that situation prompted me to begin what has become for me a joy, honestly, in devoting time and energy and resources to learning how to be a good leader. Here's why I bring that up to start. My friend Kevin, my good friend Kevin Pena, and I have kind of this ongoing joke, and maybe I've probably even said this here in church before, but Kevin sometimes says, Matt, remember, nobody is completely useless. They can at least serve as a bad example. That's what we get today, you guys, from Ezekiel chapter 34, is a bad example of how to lead. In Ezekiel chapter 34, we're going to be studying what bad shepherds look like. And I think you can probably see the picture on the wall here, at least fairly well. If not, it's a lot clearer on that TV back there. But that's the basic problem with bad shepherds, right there. You have the sheep gathered together, trying to figure out what to do on the edge of a cliff, and no shepherd in sight. Nobody to lead them, nobody to guide them, nobody to bring them back home. That's the basic idea with a bad shepherd. So we're actually going to conclude our series on sheep and shepherds with 2 consecutive weeks on shepherds. So next week we're going to look at what makes a good shepherd, and this week we're going to look at some of the characteristics of bad shepherds. And as I said, Ezekiel 34 is our passage for today, and it is actually part of a much longer rebuke from God to the shepherds of Israel. Okay? Now, not the actual literal sheep herders, not those kinds of shepherds, but the nation's leaders. Okay? The leaders had messed up big time, and God lets them know it. Now, we're only going to study the first 10 verses of Ezekiel 34, just for the sake of time. The following, however many more there are, 25, I had it open, I don't know why I closed it. The other 25 verses or so following that, God says, you guys are bad shepherds, but I will show you what a good shepherd looks like. So verses 11 through 31, God says, you guys are doing a bad job, I'll show you what a good shepherd is. Now, don't have time to study that this morning, but I want you to know that it's not really a cliffhanger. God doesn't just say, you guys are terrible, period, end of the chapter. He offers a solution. So in the Old Testament, what we need to understand, and I've mentioned this before, but let me just make it clear here. In the Old Testament, shepherds primarily are Israel's religious and governmental leaders. So this isn't limited to just their priests and their prophets and their scribes and so on. This also included kings and princes and government officials. So when we read this passage, first we need to understand that who is being addressed is Israel's religious and governmental leaders. Now, we could read a passage like this and study it and say, yeah, okay, so what? That's not me. Anybody here one of Israel's religious or governmental leaders? No. So what? What do we do with this? Well, secondarily, as we read this, we need to understand that the principles apply to us as well, because really a shepherd is anybody who's entrusted with the responsibility of leading others. Anybody. A shepherd is a leader. Okay? Now you might even read this and say, well, that's not me. I'm not a leader. I'm not in a leadership role. I'm not a mayor. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a whatever. But I'm willing to bet that you probably are a leader and you don't recognize it, if that's what you're saying. If you lead others in any capacity, pastor, elder, ministry leader, but also parent, a boss, a teacher, a spouse, leading a small group, maybe you're a team captain or a teammate who others look to, a council member, commission member, board member, whatever. If you are in a position where you are leading others or making decisions on behalf of others, you are, at least to some degree, shepherding them. In which case, this is for you. This is for me. So the big idea that I want us to grasp this morning is that no matter who or what you're leading, a church, a family, a business, a classroom, a team, a ministry, a work group, a community, whatever, no matter who it is that you are leading or what it is that you are leading, leadership is a sacred responsibility. It's a sacred responsibility. What does that mean to say something is sacred? It means that God is in it, right? That God is responsible for it. If God has given you the opportunity to lead anybody, to be a shepherd, then you owe him and you owe them your very best. It's a matter of being a faithful steward of a God-given gifts. And there are many ways to lead, and I have dozens of books on leadership in my office, and I can tell you there are many different approaches and philosophies on how to lead, but not all of these ways are God's way of leading. So godly leadership is an opportunity to influence for good and to add value to others. And there are a lot of things that could mark godly leadership, but here are just a few, okay? Godly leadership is marked by service and sacrifice. You put others first. You're willing to make personal sacrifices and concessions, okay? Godly leadership is marked by care and compassion. You demonstrate love and kindness. You do something to help others. You don't just look at problems and say, oh, that's too bad, somebody should do something. You are the one who does something. Godly leadership is marked by intentionality and integrity. Godly leaders are attentive to others' needs. They don't turn away from them and say, I hope somebody helps them. They pay attention, they notice. But they're also marked by integrity. They are morally and spiritually consistent. You know what you're going to get from a godly leader because they have demonstrated time and time again that they can be trusted. So there are also many characteristics of ungodly leadership. Many, and we're going to look at some in the passage. Not surprisingly, these indicators are basically the opposite of the marks of godly leadership. That makes sense, right? So at some point, you may have suffered under the leadership of somebody like this. Ungodly leadership is marked by selfishness and stinginess. So while godly leaders serve and sacrifice, ungodly leaders are selfish and stingy. They use others to get what they want, and they're unwilling to help or give to help others. Ungodly leadership is marked by carelessness and cruelty. So while godly leaders are caring and compassionate, ungodly leaders, they don't care how others are doing. They really don't. They're in it for themselves. They're harsh and demanding and manipulative. They're cruel. Ungodly leaders are also irresponsible and improper. Their leadership is marked by irresponsibility and impropriety. They are inattentive to those that they lead, in contrast to godly leaders who pay attention and know their people. And ungodly leaders are unpredictable. They're corrupt. They are opportunistic. They're constantly looking for ways that they can get ahead personally, even at the expense of the people that they lead. So that's just a real brief overview. I mean, we could talk about this for weeks, honestly. But that's enough of an introduction here for the difference between godly and ungodly leadership. And this stems directly from the passage that we're going to read today. So once again, leadership is a sacred responsibility. Those who are called or given opportunities to lead must remember from whom that calling and opportunity comes. It comes from God. That's what makes it a sacred responsibility. And if it comes from Him, it must be done His way. So today, as we study Ezekiel 34, 1 through 10, we're going to see an example of what not to do, how not to lead. If you want to be a good leader and a good steward of the opportunities that God has given you, do not be like these shepherds. Okay, so now that we know what we're going to be doing with this passage, let's read it. Pay attention to the problems that God points out and then see what we can learn from it. Remember, if you are responsible for leading anything or anyone, the principles in this passage will apply to you, I promise. So let's get started. Ezekiel 34, verse 1 through 3. The word of the Lord came to me. This is Ezekiel saying, this is what God told me. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. What does it mean to say that God is sovereign? Give me a little feedback here. He's above all. What else? That's good. What else? This matters for our passage. When we say God is sovereign, what does that mean? He's above all? He's in control. How does he express that control and being above all? Is he harsh? He's kind. He's gracious. He's compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love, right? So God is over all. He is in control, but he's also not a cruel taskmaster. So God says, tell the shepherds of Israel, this is what the God who is in control, lovingly and graciously, says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. In other words, you get what you can from the people, all the things that improve your life, but you don't care about them. Okay? Leadership is a sacred responsibility. And the first thing that we want to note here is that bad leaders, bad shepherds, are selfish. They are selfish. They are self-serving. They help and take care of themselves instead of those they lead. They eat the curds, clothe themselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals. They pick out the very best. They view, to put it in terms of people, they view relationships as transactional. If I give you something, then you owe me something in return. They are self-serving. Bad shepherds and bad leaders are also self-centered. The world revolves around them, their wants, their needs, not even their needs, but their goals, their personal gain. And what we see in this passage, and is so true of so many of the bad leaders that I have known, and probably you as well, but bad leaders are self-enriching. They use others and take from others to improve their own position. Remember now, this is an example of what not to do, okay? In contrast, obviously, good shepherds, good leaders are selfless. They focus on others, put others' needs first, and are always striving to add value to others, okay? So what I want you to do is I want you to think about a situation where you are or have been, or even a situation where you aspire to be a leader. It could be at home, it could be at work, church, community, anywhere. Maybe it's a position where you are a leader and wish you could do it better, okay? I want you to ask yourself this question. Would those that you lead say that you serve them or serve yourself? Would those that you lead say that you serve them or serve yourself? Now, I'm not asking you if you think you serve them. I'm asking you what they would say. Do your attitudes and actions as a leader in your home, at your business, in your school, wherever, do those demonstrate that you are in it for the good of those you lead? Leadership is a sacred responsibility, one that requires us to be selfless and put others' needs ahead of our own. Now, the tricky thing about selfishness is that it doesn't always reveal itself in the things that we do. Sometimes selfishness becomes clear, and it becomes clear that we're in it for ourselves by the things that we don't do. Sins of omission. Those things that we know we ought to do, but we choose not to do, or we neglect to do. Those sins of omission are often more sinister and more harmful than the sins of commission, the bad things we actually do. And almost always do sins of omission, the things we neglect to do, lead us in the direction of committing further sins. So let's keep reading here. We're going to read verses 4 through 6, okay? God says this. He says, he's speaking to the shepherds here again, you have not, see, these are omissions, things they have not done. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered, because there was no shepherd. Now, isn't that interesting? These guys were shepherds, but God says, not really. They really didn't have a shepherd because you guys were in charge. They had no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep, who do the sheep belong to? The people that we lead? Who do they belong to? They belong to God, not us, okay? My sheep, God says, wandered all over the mountains and on every hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Now again, at the end of this chapter of Ezekiel 34, God says, so I tell you what, I'm going to go get them. I'm going to go get the sheep. I'm going to redeem them. I'm going to bring them back. Forget you guys, okay? But for now, let's continue to study what makes these shepherds terrible, okay? So here God names some specific issues that he had with the bad shepherds, and this isn't just an exhaustive list, or this isn't an exhaustive list, it's just a representation of their poor leadership. So the second thing we see here is that bad leaders are cruel. They are cruel. They're not just aloof, they're not just disinterested, they're actually cruel. They are cold. They're cold. They rule with harshness and brutality. They use force, they use coercion, they use manipulation because they don't care about the people they lead. They just simply don't care. Okay? Bad leaders are also calloused. You know what that means, right? Like you get to the point where you just don't feel it anymore. That's what calluses literally do on our fingers, on our hands, wherever we get them. They kind of numb the feeling, right? So bad leaders are callous. They are unmoved by the pain and the problems and the predicaments of others. And that's clear from verses 4 and 5. God says to them basically, look, you guys, you had weak people, sick people, injured people, and straying people and lost people under your leadership. And you didn't care. You didn't strengthen them. You didn't bring them back. You didn't heal them. You didn't bind them up, right? Didn't try to set the bones or help them along. You didn't search for them. You didn't bring them back. Instead, you were harsh and brutal. So you can almost picture in the metaphor that God's using here, some wounded little sheep on the edge of this cliff here, and the bad shepherd comes along and says, "What's wrong with you?" and kicks him over the edge, instead of saying, you poor thing, picks him up, puts him over his shoulder, and brings him back. Like we read about Jesus doing when we read in Luke 15 about the story of the one lost sheep. Bad leaders are also careless. They're careless. They ignore the needs of those they lead, and what happens by ignoring the needs of those who need to be strengthened, need to be bound up, need to be brought back, when you ignore them, what happens is that you leave them exposed and vulnerable, standing on the edge of the cliff with no shepherd in sight. In contrast, good shepherds and good leaders are compassionate. They're patient, they're kind, they're forgiving, they're encouraging, they're lovingly attentive to those that they lead. Okay, so again, I want you to think about a situation where you are or have been or aspire to be a leader. Put yourself in this situation, okay? Would you say your leadership is marked by compassion or coercion? You know what that means, right? Trying to get people to do what you want them to do so that you can benefit from it? How do I know? You might say, well, when those you're leading are struggling, when they disappoint you, when they let you down, how do you respond to them? Do you push them harder? Do you beat them down with insults or demands? Do you devalue them or disregard their personal struggles? Maybe you just give up on them. That's what the shepherds here did. But leadership is a sacred responsibility, one that requires us to draw regularly from this very deep well of Christ-like compassion. See, the fact that leadership is a sacred responsibility means that God has given us the opportunity to do it, given us the opportunity or the calling to do it, but it also means that he gives us the strength to do it. So we must draw from whatever God gives us to be able to lead well. So, leadership is a sacred responsibility marked by compassion. Do it God's way. So, bad leaders are selfish. Bad leaders are cruel. As you look at yourself and opportunities that you have had to lead in your community, in your home, in your place of work, wherever it might be, on your team, whatever it is, how are you doing so far? Are you an example of what not to do? Are you an example of what to do? Well, in the next three verses here, 7, 8, and 9, kind of like a courtroom judge, God basically provides a summary of the charges against these bad shepherds. So it's kind of repetitive from what we just read, but it's like a summary of the charges. You have been charged with this. And he makes sure that they understand the seriousness of their sins and the consequences that their poor leadership has had on those they failed to lead. So let's read verses 7, 8, and 9. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord. So God is making a promise here. He's making an oath that is contingent on the fact that he is alive. So in other words, there is zero chance that this will not happen. Like this is a promise. This is what will happen. God's saying, just as surely as I'm alive, this is what will happen next, okay? So surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock, therefore you shepherds hear the word of the Lord. And then the punchline's coming next, okay? But let's just review this real quickly. So again, God is summarizing the charges here, letting them know what their consequences are for their leadership and the consequences on those they failed to lead. The bad leaders, you will note from this passage that we've read all the way so far through verse 9, you will note that the bad leaders thought much of themselves, but thought so little of the flock. But did you notice in this passage how little God regards the bad shepherds and how much he regards his flock? It's really interesting, isn't it? And that's a biblical principle, right? Basically, there's two ways to learn humility. You can humble yourself or God will humble you. Well, this is about to be God humbling them, okay? Now, I want you to take note of this, that when we are given a leadership role by God, no matter what that leadership role is, He expects us to treat those that we lead as if they belong to him, not to us. And if you can get that right, I promise you will be on the way to becoming a better leader. Okay? Where do you see this in the passage? Again, there's that phrase, my flock. Verse 8, my flock. When God entrusts us with leadership, one of the most basic and important principles that we must understand and apply is that the people that I am leading, whether these are my employees, my children, my teammates, my coworkers, my fellow community members, whatever, these people belong to God, not me. And if we can get that right, then we can begin to view the opportunity as stewards rather than as bosses, as leaders rather than just managers, okay? People we lead belong to God, not us. So the third characteristic here of bad shepherds and bad leaders is that they are negligent. They're negligent. They are not present, either literally or figuratively. Either they're literally not present, like in the picture we have up here where there's no shepherd in sight, or like the boss I was telling you about who for 4 years, had his door closed and came to see me twice. They're either literally not present or figuratively they're not present. They're around, but they're just not engaged, okay? Bad leaders are negligent. They are not present. They're not available to those they lead. They're also not attentive. And that's either by choice or just by ignorance. They don't notice other people's predicaments. They either just decide not to get involved in the problems of their people, or they just are so wrapped up in themselves they don't even notice that people are hurting. And they're not responsible. And honestly, irresponsibility is a mark of immaturity. If you can't trust somebody with oversight, they're not ready to be a leader. Bad leaders are negligent. They're not responsible. So in contrast, of course, good shepherds, good leaders, they're not negligent. They're engaged. They're right in the middle of whatever is going on in the group that they are leading. Good leaders enter into tough situations. They notice important details, and they give their best to those that they lead. They are mature. So once again, think about a situation where you are or have been or aspire to be a leader. Here's a simple question to know whether or not you're doing a good job or did a good job. Are those you lead better off because you're leading them? It's such a simple question. When you are given the opportunity to lead others, how do you evaluate whether you're doing a good job or not? Look at the people you're leading. Are they better now than they were when you started? Are you leaving them better than you found them, in other words? The true measure of good leadership is not in how much you accomplish, not in how much you make, it's not even in how far you go. The true measure of leadership is whether or not the people you lead are better off because you are their shepherd. Leadership is a sacred responsibility, and to do it well, we must be attentive to and responsive to the needs of those God has entrusted to our care. So the last verse we're going to study today is the punchline, right? It's God's judgment upon these selfish, cruel, negligent shepherds. We saw what happened to their sheep. Because they were bad leaders, their sheep were hungry. They were sick, they were injured, they were scattered, they were endangered, they were lost eventually. But what will happen to the bad shepherds? Well, this is what God says. This is what the sovereign Lord says, the God who is above all, who is in control and rules with grace, compassion, patience, tenderness, and mercy. He says, I'm against the shepherds, and I will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. And then again, as I mentioned a couple times already, in the following 20 verses or so, God says, and this is how I'll do it. I'm going to go look for my sheep. I'm going to bring them back. They're scattered. I'm going to rescue them and bring them from all over the globe. They're going to come back to me. So he reveals his plan to save the world. Basically, God does next. But what do we learn from this? Okay, what for our situation here, what can we learn from this? Well, since it is God who gave these leaders position and opportunity, it is God who will call them into account. We need to remember that. Remember, we're learning that leadership is a sacred responsibility, and that means that leaders are responsible to or accountable to the sacred one. That's God himself. So the fourth characteristic here of bad shepherds or bad leaders is that they are liable. They are liable. They're responsible. Ultimately, they are accountable for the work that they have done as leaders. Now, I want you to note how God responds to these irresponsible bad shepherds, these bad leaders in Israel. First of all, notice that God says that he opposes them. You guys, that's a step further from God just being upset. You realize that, right? God gives grace to the humble, but he opposes the proud. That's different, right? God, isn't God just saying, well, I'm just kind of tired of you. This isn't God just saying, well, I'm so sick of it, I'm just not even going to pay attention anymore. It's not God saying, well, I guess I'll just put up with you. This is God saying, I'm going to get in your face and oppose you. And believe me, you guys, you don't want to be in that position where God opposes you. God doesn't just endure or ignore bad leaders. He is actually against them. Now, let me say this. Some of you, when I say that statement or read this or think about that, you might say, oh, really? Because I had a bad boss for a long time. And it sure didn't seem like God was opposed to him. We have got to learn to view things from an eternal perspective as well, not just temporal. Yeah, there are times, and I have seen times when it's like God just sort of sweeps the legs out from right underneath people in leadership who are taking advantage of others. I have seen that happen. And it's hard not to just feel a little bit vindicated when that happens. Like, yeah, get him, God. Yeah. But then I remember, oh, right, me too. I have this responsibility as well. So sometimes God will do that. But we have to remember that God views things from an eternal perspective, not just a temporal perspective. So the opposition from God is not always going to be seen by us in the right here and right now. Sometimes it's in the what's to come. And we have to remember that. Okay? So God not only, he doesn't just endure or ignore bad leaders, he is actually against them. We see that God judges them, and he's really, you guys, the only one who is truly fit to do so, who can do so with complete neutrality and sincerity. God entrusts shepherds or leaders with so much, so he requires much from them. That's a biblical principle as well, right? To whom much is given, much will be expected. So God opposes, God judges, and then in some cases, God even removes bad leaders from their positions. And he says that's what he's going to do here to the shepherds of Israel. You guys have just blown it so bad, he says, I'm just going to take your jobs right away from you. You won't even have anybody to lead anymore. I'm going to find a new way to do this and get rid of you guys. Bad shepherds or bad leaders are liable for the damage they do, but good leaders, good shepherds, are actually rewarded for the value they add. And that's what we're going to study next week, among other things, but we're going to take a look at the rewards of leadership next week and other things as well. A calling or an invitation to leadership is a calling and an invitation to stewardship. Okay? God entrusts us with something that belongs to him, people, and he asks us to give our best to them and lead them like God leads them. So as you reflect on today's passage and message, ask yourself just one more question here, okay? Have you been a good steward of those entrusted to your care? Have you been a good steward of those entrusted to your care? And I guess another question that's maybe assumed in that is, will you be a good steward of those entrusted to your care? Moving forward, will you? Well, I hope the answer to that is yeah. I mean, I get why this is so important. But looking back, have you been? Have you been a good steward in the past? If not, it's not too late to turn things around. You can change, you can learn, you can grow. If God has called you to lead, those under your care deserve your best, okay? One last time here, leadership is a sacred responsibility. No matter who or what you are leading, a church, a family, a community, a business, a classroom, a team, a ministry, a work group, whatever. If God has given you the opportunity to lead, and God has given you the opportunity to shepherd others, you owe him and you owe them your very best. It is a matter of being a faithful steward of a God-given gift. So that is what we learn from the bad example of the bad shepherds in Israel. Now, are there other lessons that we could glean from those 10 verses? Oh, you bet there are. And they're not all to do with leadership. There are many other things in there as well, but this is what I felt like the message was for us this week. Be good leaders in whatever leadership capacity God has given you. Okay, let's pray about this. Father, we thank you that even before we are ready, sometimes you entrust us with caring for and leading others. Lord, I believe that sometimes these leadership roles that you place us in are a size too big for us. And we have to grow into those. So Lord, as we do that, I pray that you would help us to be godly leaders in the way that we lead our families, our community, our church, our business, our classroom, our teams, our ministries, whatever it is, God, that you've placed us over, help us to be godly, not to be selfish or cruel or negligent, but instead to be loving, selfless, kind, compassionate, and attentive, to be a leader that reflects you and your character. Lord, help us to remember that we must give an account to you for all that you've entrusted to us, including the people that you've entrusted to us to lead. Lord, in these situations, we ask for grace, that you would help us be good leaders, and we also ask for forgiveness for the times when we have fallen short. Lord, from this point forward, we ask that you would help us to reflect the love and grace and patience and compassion of Jesus in every situation where we find ourselves leading. Lord, help us to remember that it is a sacred responsibility that you have given to us, and help us to be good stewards of that. We pray and ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.